August 1945, near Agana on Guam, the coral dust had gone chalk white by noon and clung to the canvas tilt of the 212-ton trucks as they eased through the gate. In the rear benches sat Japanese nurses, clerks, and signal operators taken on Saipan and Tinian, their hands folded tight against the jolt of ruts, their minds braced for the arithmetic of punishment, thin rations, shouted orders, the humiliation of forced labor. The wire glittered in the hard light. A guard's M1 carbine hung easy at his hip. The air tasted of salt and hot metal. By late afternoon, the heat bled off the ground, and a small engine coughed alive beyond the mess tents. Not the bark of a command, but the steady, unfamiliar putter of a portable generator. One of the Army's field units, the kind that fed strings of bare bulbs in forward camps. Dusk gathered, and with it came the soft, mechanical chatter that none of them had expected. The toothy click of a 16mm projector. Bell and Howell models were common, throwing a grey river of light toward a canvas sheet. When the first frames caught, faces flickered into being, and soldiers settled on benches to a Hollywood swashbuckler many camps favored from 1940, the Mark of Zorro. Laughter rose and fell without cruelty. A woman who had rehearsed how not to cry if struck stared instead at a blade flashing only on a screen and wondered what sort of enemy built a theater behind barbed wire. Fear loosened not under a blow but under confusion, and in that confusion something else took root. The suspicion that captivity here would be ruled by rules they had never been taught. The reel ended to polite clapping. The bulbs hummed on and the night held. By morning the camp would measure them, register them, and most unthinkably feed them. June 1944. Saipan. Dawn spread over the ridges in slow sheets of gold, carrying with it the drone of American aircraft and the smell of cordite that clung even after the guns had cooled. In the caverns along the island's cliffs, Japanese nurses and clerks huddled among the wounded, their uniforms stained with iodine and dust. For months they had heard only one message repeated in broadcasts and printed leaflets. Surrender meant desecration. American soldiers, they were told, spared no one. Women would be violated, mutilated, paraded as trophies. It was a creed of annihilation more than defense, and they had believed it fully. So when the bombardment stopped, and the Marines of the 3rd Division advanced through the cane fields with flamethrowers and bulldozers, many of the women pressed grenades to their chests or sought cliffs from which to leap. Yet not all obeyed that fatal command. Hunger, exhaustion, and the faintest instinct to live led dozens from the caves. White rags tied to bamboo poles, surrender flags torn from hospital sheets stiff with disinfectant. What met them was not vengeance but procedure. The Marines, sweating in the heat, ordered them to lie down only long enough for a corpsman to check for hidden weapons. Then came canteens of water, medical tags and K-ration biscuits that crumbled in shaking hands. An American interpreter noted how they stared at the food as if it were bait. Over the next weeks, similar scenes unfolded on Tinian and Guam. Trucks, marked with red crosses, ferried these women, classified by Army paperwork as Category 2 civilian internees, onto temporary compounds built with the same lumber used for U.S. field hospitals. Barbed wire and sentries framed the perimeter, yet inside stood orderly rows of tents, mess lines, and latrines. There were no whips, no forced labor columns, only schedules and silence. To minds forged under bushidō, the belief that death purified defeat, this orderliness felt like mockery. They could not comprehend an enemy who captured without cruelty. Fear gave way to bewilderment, and bewilderment became the fragile threshold of something they could not yet name. The myths of empire were unraveling thread by thread, and by the time night fell over Guam, the women who had expected to die were instead alive, and utterly lost in a world that refused to hate them. September 1945. The humid night above Guam throbbed with the sound of diesel engines and cicadas. Under the glare of electric floodlights, a convoy from the 3rd Marine Division rumbled through the new perimeter of Camp Guam No. 2, a facility that looked less like a prison and more like an organized village born from blueprints rather than fear. By the end of the war, the United States had perfected the art of confinement into a science. Across its territories and the mainland, more than 500 prisoner of war and internment camps held upward of 400,000 Axis captives, Italians in Arizona, Germans in Oklahoma, Japanese in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. Each was overseen by the Office of the Provost Marshal General, whose memos emphasized compliance with the 1929 Geneva Convention, adequate shelter, medical care, education, even recreation. It was bureaucracy as morality, an empire of order meant to prove that civilization itself could outlast barbarity. Camp Guam No. 2 was typical of that design. Rows of prefabricated Quonset huts curved against the landscape like ribbed shells, each wired with electric light and fitted with sanitation units fed by pumps and chlorinated tanks. The mess hall was a corrugated structure with long wooden tables, its kitchen stocked with Army field ranges and bulk tins labeled U.S. Quartermaster. Adjacent stood the infirmary, its Red Cross flag fluttering in the sea breeze, staffed by medics who treated wounds without regard to insignia. Most astonishing to the women internees, however, was the final feature, a recreation tent. Inside were benches, a phonograph, shelves for books, and later a projector. In official records, this space was described as morale stabilization infrastructure. In practice, it was psychological warfare executed with civility. The policy, born from President Roosevelt's conviction that peace was secured through justice rather than revenge, aimed to make every enemy captive, an unwilling witness to American ideals. To the Japanese women who stepped beneath those electric bulbs, the geometry of the camp, its clean rows, its logic, its restraint, felt alien, almost theatrical. The fences glittered under light instead of menace, and that paradox unsettled them more than punishment could have. Within that architecture of decency, they would soon confront America's strangest weapon of all, empathy cast in flickering light. September 1945. Guam night settled like warm smoke over the camp, the smell of diesel and salt clinging to the canvas roofs of the Quonset huts. Beyond the wire, generators coughed to life in a rhythmic sputter, their pistons churning out the heartbeat of a new and bewildering ritual. From the supply depot came wooden crates stamped U.S. Army Special Services Division, Motion Picture Equipment, Type D. Inside lay the unlikely instruments of America's next offensive, Bell Howell 2709 projectors, 16mm and 35mm reels, collapsible screens, and portable gasoline generators. What had begun in 1944 as a morale program for soldiers now reached into the world of prisoners, carried along the same logistical arteries that supplied rations and medical kits. The War Relocation Authority authorized the use of surplus entertainment apparatus for select internment sites, a gesture of calculated compassion meant to demonstrate civilization through light. The projector assigned to Camp Guam No. 2 came with instructions typed in precise quartermaster English. Operate only under ventilation. Screen distance 12 feet minimum. The men of the 307th Infantry Regiment's Welfare Office unpacked it like priests handling relics, threading the first reel through its sprockets under a single floodlight. Ammunition crates became benches. An old canvas wall became the screen. The chosen film, The Adventures of Robin Hood, had already played before hundreds of GIs during the war, its Technicolor reels now stripped to grayscale on 16mm stock. As the first flicker hit the cloth, guards and internees sat in the same humid darkness, faces silvered by motion. For the Japanese women, accustomed to equating Americans with monsters, the laughter that rippled from their captors was the most confounding sound of all. Some whispered that it must be a trick, an experiment in humiliation. Yet no commentary followed, no mockery, just a story unfolding, a thief who defied kings, a heroine who believed in mercy. The interpreter later recorded in his log, "They did not understand the words, but they understood that nobody was angry. Each frame of light etched a contradiction deeper than any speech could." What had entered the camp as a machine of leisure became something more enduring, a bridge of shadows and brightness, softening the edges of war. October 1945. Guam, the war was over, but another campaign had begun. One fought not with rifles or radio broadcasts, but with light and laughter. To the American command, the screenings were never merely diversions. They were instruments in a calculated psychological operation, designed as gently as the bombs that had ended the conflict, were brutal. The Office of War Information, working in tandem with the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Branch, saw in the projectors an unexpected weapon, persuasion through normalcy. Rather than the shrill propaganda that Axis powers had mastered, these reels offered something quieter, more subversive, the ordinariness of peace. Romantic comedies, swing-filled musicals, newsreels of reconstruction and harvest replaced the din of slogans. To an indoctrinated mind, normal life could be more destabilizing than defeat. The Pacific Military Intelligence Section later reported that the effect was measurable. In one account, a nurse from the Women's Volunteer Corps, who had been taught that American women were frivolous and corrupt, watched as Claudette Colbert and Rosalind Russell played professionals commanding respect on screen. They were astonished that American women appeared as equals, an officer observed. What Tokyo had painted as moral decay now looked like liberation. Inside the recreation tent, every reel became a mirror, reflecting a civilization that contradicted everything they had been told. Yet the process was uneven. Some internees refused to attend, muttering that hidden codes might poison their loyalty. Others hovered outside, watching the silhouettes of the audience rather than the film. Slowly, week by week, the edges softened. Laughter began to cross the line between guard and captive. A shared rhythm of amusement replaced the rigid silence of indoctrination. To the Americans, the policy fit Roosevelt's conviction that compassion itself was strategic. To the Japanese women, it felt like disorientation wrapped in grace. Each film night chipped away at the myth of an inhuman enemy, replacing it with a bewildering truth, that mercy could educate as effectively as any lecture. And soon that lesson would step off the screen, translated into acts more tangible than light, into medicine, meals, and the everyday rituals of kindness that turned captivity into comprehension. November 1945. Guam. The monsoon season brought rain that hammered the corrugated roofs of Camp No. 2 like 1,000 typewriters, turning paths between huts into streams of red clay. Inside the camp infirmary, the smell of antiseptic mixed with wet canvas. The U.S. Army's 148th General Hospital, only a few miles away, had begun to feel the strain of treating thousands of soldiers awaiting transport home. Bandages ran short, wards overflowed, and nurses rotated through 20-hour shifts. Out of necessity rather than sentiment, the hospital's commander, Lieutenant Colonel John A. Harrington, requested volunteers from the internee population, specifically those trained in medicine. To the astonishment of both guards and staff, several Japanese women stepped forward. Identifying themselves as former field nurses from Saipan and Tinian, they were issued plain armbands marked Aid and escorted under watch to the wards. At first, silence governed the room. Words failed where suspicion lingered. But the language of medicine needed little translation. Hands guided by habit found their rhythm. Gauze folded, thermometers checked, morphine doses recorded. American medics soon admitted admiration. Harrington's December report noted competence, humility, and diligence of the highest order. One corporal later wrote home that he had been tended by the same enemy I had feared to meet alive. For the Japanese nurses, the work became a reprieve from the paralysis of captivity, a return to purpose that transcended flag or uniform. That winter, the Welfare Office arranged a joint screening for hospital staff and internees. The chosen film, Pride of the Marines, 1945, told of a blinded veteran learning to live again. As its final reel unspooled, many sat unmoving, Americans and Japanese alike seeing their own reflection in the story's endurance. The following week, Red Cross inspectors recorded an almost tangible calm across the compound. Fewer fevers, fewer quarrels, more conversation. Healing, it seemed, had become mutual. In those makeshift wards, under the hum of generators and the flicker of celluloid, the war's former enemies found common ground through the oldest gestures of civilization: care and compassion. Yet as repatriation orders loomed, that fragile peace would face its hardest test. What would remain when the lights dimmed and the reels stopped turning? January 1946. Guam. The war had been over for months, yet inside the camp the rhythm of routine continued. Morning roll call, medical inspections, evening screenings. Then one morning, a new announcement passed along the rows of Quonset huts with a murmur that felt almost unreal. The internees would be permitted to write home. Paper, ink, and envelopes were distributed under the seal of the International Red Cross. Each letter would be censored, read and stamped before being carried to Tokyo through naval dispatch routes. For the Japanese women, it was the first sanctioned bridge between captivity and the world they had left behind. At first they wrote cautiously, reports stripped of emotion, names verified, dates clipped short. They had been taught that such correspondence would never reach their families intact, that any praise of the enemy might mark them as traitors. Yet the temptation to tell the truth proved stronger than fear. Within weeks, a new tone crept into the pages. Surviving fragments in Japan's censorship archives record words that startled even the officers assigned to intercept them. "We are treated humanely. We are given blankets and milk. We watch moving pictures of America." The statements defied every image broadcast by wartime propaganda. In Tokyo, military censors debated authenticity. Some dismissed the letters as American fabrications. Others quietly marked them psychologically corrosive. For the first time, written testimony threatened the myth that surrender meant dishonor or torture. Among the civilians and stragglers who still hid in caves or ruins, rumors spread. Captivity might not mean death after all. Those words, born of movie light and shared labor, traveled farther than the women themselves. When the U.S. Navy's repatriation program began embarking returnees aboard Liberty ships that spring, many of the nurses and clerks folded their letters into the pockets of uniforms that hung loose from weight lost and illusions shed. Ink had accomplished what arms could not. It had pierced ideology. The empire that once ruled minds through silence was now undone by sentences of mercy, written in the handwriting of its daughters. April 1946, Apra Harbor, Guam. The sea lay flat as glass beneath a grey morning sky when the USS General W.WWII Man eased away from the pier. On deck stood several dozen Japanese women, once nurses and clerks of the imperial forces, now passengers of repatriation. Their luggage was small. Canvas satchels marked civilian internee, a few Red Cross parcels and folded letters approved for delivery upon arrival. The ship's wake shimmered through waters that had once carried invasion fleets. For the first time in years, the direction of travel pointed toward home. Yet few smiled. The voyage north was heavy with silence, broken only by the churn of the ship's engines and the occasional burst of music from the mess deck radio, American swing, jaunty and indifferent to memory. When Yokohama came into view weeks later, it was a city half rebuilt and half ashamed. American occupation forces met the ship with efficiency and distance, recording names and assigning quarantine inspections. To Japanese officials, however, the women represented a complication. In the lingering shadow of bushidō, surrender was a wound that could not be healed by survival. Some arrivals were met with blank faces, others with polite disbelief. Family registries had been purged, employment offices closed their doors, and former comrades turned away. A few women concealed their imprisonment entirely, inventing wartime duties to erase the stain of captivity. But within them, a different record endured. They remembered the flicker of film against canvas, the smell of diesel from the generator, the sound of laughter that had once confused and comforted them. One nurse later wrote that she could no longer watch Casablanca without recalling the strange peace of Guam, the light that forgave us. In that memory, America's victory transcended armies. It became moral, emotional, human. While occupation authorities rebuilt Japan's cities with concrete and steel, these women rebuilt something quieter, the idea that mercy was possible even in war. Their silence became its own testimony, a living paradox carried home beneath the flags of two nations no longer at war. As scholars later reopened the archives, those buried stories re-emerged, reshaping not only history, but the meaning of compassion itself. By the mid-1950s, the vaults of the U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's office began to open, releasing a flood of wartime documentation that scholars scarcely knew how to interpret. Buried among logistics reports and Geneva compliance audits were brief, almost casual references to motion picture rehabilitation initiatives and cinema therapy protocols conducted in Pacific POW installations. For years, the files gathered dust, too minor for military historians, too anomalous for psychologists. When Japanese academics first encountered them in translation during the 1960s, the reaction was disbelief. The notion that female internees on Guam or Hawaii had been treated to Hollywood films seemed to many an indulgent American myth. Their national narrative still framed captivity as humiliation and mercy as post-war propaganda. Only in the 1980s did a new generation of researchers from both nations begin to trace the threads back through declassified archives. Cross-referenced inventories of camp equipment revealed repeated entries for Bell Howell Projector, 16mm operational, logged beside rations and medical supplies. The records aligned with oral histories gathered from surviving nurses and clerks. Each told the same sensory story: the hum of the generator, the faint smell of gasoline, the ripple of laughter under barbed wire, the emotional vertigo of comfort where punishment had been expected. These memories did not fit neatly within old categories of victor and victim. American analysts later interpreted the program as evidence of moral leadership, the Geneva spirit made visible. Japanese historians countered that it remained, at least partly, psychological warfare in silk gloves. Yet the deeper truth lay between. Cinema had functioned as both solace and strategy, uniting captor and captive in a fragile communion that outlasted ideology. Through these rediscoveries, the forgotten women of Guam returned to history not as footnotes of surrender, but as witnesses to the uneasy triumph of compassion. Their experience would echo far beyond its time, shaping debates on humanitarian ethics and the treatment of prisoners for generations to come. Tokyo, 1948. The theaters smelled of damp wood and cigarette smoke, their projectors newly repaired with scavenged American parts. Outside, rubble still framed the skyline, but inside, audiences sat transfixed before screens that glowed with imported light. Under Allied occupation, Japan's post-war cinema was being reborn, not as an echo of imperial propaganda, but as an art of reflection. Directors like Keisuke Kinoshita and Yasujiro Ozu, once constrained by wartime censors, began shaping stories around compassion, uncertainty, and moral reconstruction. Gone were the martial hymns and sacrificial heroes. In their place came quiet acts of grace, a son returning to ruined parents, a nurse tending both soldier and stranger. Cultural historians later traced a faint but unmistakable thread running through this shift: the influence of women who had returned from captivity. Some had become teachers, others nurses in Tokyo hospitals, carrying memories they could rarely speak aloud: the hum of generators in Guam, the laughter of enemies, the films that had softened fear into wonder. When they described those screenings, students listened. The American screen, once a symbol of corruption, had become a window into empathy. Curiosity replaced hatred, and cinema became a bridge across ruins. By the early 1950s, theaters in Osaka and Tokyo played Roman Holiday, It's a Wonderful Life, and other imports to standing room crowds, the same titles that had once flickered across camp tents half a world away. Audiences wept not from defeat but recognition. The light that had once fallen on prisoners' faces now illuminated a nation learning to feel again. The irony was immense and beautiful. The enemy's art of persuasion had become Japan's art of healing. Through film, the country began to translate war guilt into human understanding, a transformation that would soon turn cinema itself into a quiet instrument of diplomacy between former foes. Geneva, 1949. The delegates gathered in a hall still echoing with the unfinished peace of the last war. Among the papers spread before them were drafts marked with an unfamiliar phrase: "Recreational and educational facilities shall be provided to prisoners of war." Few realized that the clause's origin traced back not to Europe's grand theaters of combat, but to small projection tents on islands like Guam and Oahu. The U.S. Army's wartime insistence on humane confinement, its infrastructure of compassion, as the Provost Marshal General had called it, had quietly rewritten the world's understanding of captivity. The movie nights, once dismissed as morale novelties, had become moral precedent. In the new Geneva Conventions of 1949, those flickering lights found permanence in law. When the Korean War erupted only a year later, the United Nations Command drew explicitly on these WWII models. Camp administrators distributed books, organized lectures, and projected films for captured soldiers under the same doctrine of psychological restoration through cultural engagement. In a quiet symmetry of history, Japanese Red Cross delegates, many of them veterans of the empire that had once scorned surrender, now helped oversee those programs. The circle closed without fanfare. The students of mercy had become its teachers. Among the consultants who reviewed the Geneva drafts were anonymous testimonies from former internees, women whose words confirmed that dignity could survive captivity if given the smallest means to breathe. Their stories, recorded without names, validated the idea that culture itself could heal trauma. What began as an experiment of empathy under guard towers evolved into a cornerstone of humanitarian science. Yet beyond all the clauses and precedents, the legacy's essence remained simple and human. The memory of light across weary faces, the hum of a generator cutting through night, and the realization that even in surrender, one could still be seen, still be understood. In that recognition, reconciliation had already begun. August 1995. Guam. The air was thick with ocean salt and the distant sound of cicadas as veterans, former internees, and their families gathered under a white pavilion near the ruins of Camp No. 2. 50 years had passed since surrender, yet the island still carried the quiet echo of both empire and mercy. Beneath banners marking the Pacific War's end stood tables lined with artifacts, faded Red Cross parcels, a nurse's armband, a rusted canteen. At the center of the display rested a relic that drew every eye, a restored Bell Howell projector, its metal polished to a muted silver, the same model that had once cast laughter across the barbed wire compound. When dusk fell, technicians loaded a reel of Casablanca into its gate, and the beam that had once bridged enemies cut through the tropical night once more. The audience sat together on folding chairs, American veterans now gray-haired, Japanese women in neat summer dresses, grandchildren between them. As the film began, conversation stopped. The same flicker that had once softened captivity now illuminated faces lined by decades. News photographers captured tears and laughter, mingled without shame. Later interviews revealed that few remembered the dialogue or plot. What endured was the sensation, the warmth of shared humanity amid war's cold machinery. One former nurse said softly that the projector's hum sounded like forgiveness. For the Americans, those screenings had once been routine duty, a moral exercise in restraint. For the Japanese women, they had been revelation, the first proof that compassion could survive conquest. Now in reunion, both sides understood that the true victory of those nights was conscience, not conquest. When the credits rolled, no one applauded. They simply stood together in the pale glow of the final frame. The beam faded, leaving only the shimmer of memory, light that had once pierced darkness, now shining quietly within those who had seen it. History so often records its wars in the vocabulary of destruction, cities leveled, tonnage dropped, lives counted like broken glass. Yet sometimes the truest light endures not in conquest but in captivity. On a humid Pacific night in 1945, Japanese women who expected torment instead found themselves watching flickering images on a sheet of canvas. What began as a military curiosity, a projector powered by a gasoline generator, became an experiment in something older than strategy: mercy. Beneath barbed wire and palm shadows, captors and captives shared the same laughter, the same moments of silence, the same recognition that humanity had somehow survived the machinery of hate. Those reels have long since crumbled, their nitrate turned to dust, but their radiance lingers in the memories they ignited. From Guam to Tokyo, from forgotten letters to reunion halls, that fragile glow passed between generations as proof that kindness could outlive ideology. The screenings were never meant to rewrite history, yet they became its quiet correction. In the arithmetic of war, so obsessed with victory and loss, these small acts of decency became the truest measure of civilization. The story closes where it began, in darkness with the soft whir of a reel starting to turn, and the first pulse of light reminding the world that compassion, once projected, can never entirely fade.